Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today, we're going to be talking to a genuine thought Christian and wants public goods funded voluntarily through crowdfunding. Theodore, how are you?
Keith, I'm great. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine. So I am actually going to be debating you on this issue. I will try to make objections that are not straw men. So if I do, please let me know in the comments below. Are you ready, Theodore?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's have a friendly debate about crowdfunded government.
Okay. So, Theodore, what is crowd-funded government?
The idea for crowdfunded government is to take the government that we have now and to keep the basic operations the same with one twist. We still want the elections, we still want the politicians, but the big change is how taxation and the funding for government programs work. The taxation is theft, and the idea that the government can take your money is reprehensible. So the idea is leave the politicians in place, have them create the same programs, but give us the chance to contribute as much as we want to the programs that we want. And that's the big change for crowdfunded government. So we're introducing crowdfunding into government, and with the end goal of eliminating taxation ultimately.
And what happens if not enough people fund government, therefore there's a shortage? What happens in that case?
In that case, the budgets are created with 100% expectation. If less than 100% is collected for any budget, there is a preparation in place based on the labor, material, assets, and equipment required to operate each program, and there's a sliding scale from 100% down to 0% for how that program will function. And over time, the market will correct. If people don't like 50% of their potholes being filled, they will give more in the long run to the pothole program. And you can see that happening with all of the programs, which is people will eventually get exactly the level of government that they want. And it's all based on the free market principle of allowing the voluntary action of your dollars out of your wallet into government programs.
So if people can choose what to fund and what not to fund, can they choose what laws to follow as well?
I don't take it too radically, and this is actually why I'm probably the least popular guy on Twitter, even though you would think that I'd be a pretty popular guy among anarchist circles, is because I still believe in the rule of law. I still believe that politicians should be making laws, and I still believe that the enforcement of the laws should be taking place. However, it's the enforcement of the laws that requires money. And that's where the people have an ultimate say. Let's say, for example, you have a speed trap program in a small town. If nobody in that small town gives to the speed trap program, how can the police operate the speed trap program? So there is a way for communities to opt out of different programs, but that's through the voluntary choice of their money. But I don't believe that you should have the right to break the law. I'm still a believer in the constitutional republic. I'm still a believer in the rule of law. And I'm still representing that the government should have the monopoly on force, at least in the short or medium terms.
So if there's a monopoly, why should government have it and not me and my 535 closest friends?
Well, that would be a good discussion for localization, which is another key element of crowdfunded government. One of the biggest parts of crowdfunded government is creating transparent budgets and allowing the government to operate as localized as possible. So anytime we get a chance, why should certain programs be federalized? Why should certain programs be operated at the state level? Every program should be as localized as possible. And if it gets down to that point, you and 535 of your neighbors, that would seem to me to be the most voluntary association of them all, which is the smallest amount of people in the smallest geographic area making the most decisions for their lives.
Does the Constitution give Congress the right to enact tariffs or involuntary methods of taxation?
Well, it gets into politics as opposed to the programs. So that's where I've always drawn the line on crowdfunded government. I've always felt that there is an apolitical nature to crowdfunded government, which is the government should have the right to do whatever the people pay for it to do. However, when you start getting into a discussion of tariffs, for example, that becomes a purely political discussion. And there would obviously be an enforcement mechanism for the tariffs, but ultimately that's where you start getting into the line of politics, which I don't necessarily recommend changing. So you would still have the ability for politicians to pass laws, very technocratic laws such as that one that involve very specific decisions about the way that certain amounts of money are collected. But ultimately, that's one of those things where we still have politicians and we still have them making political decisions such as tariff rates. Now, ultimately, from a crowd-funded government perspective, I don't like tariffs. I like voluntary relationships between the state and people. So I would be against tariffs. However, again, we have to allow politicians and the people to get the government that they want. So there is still an element of politicians being able to pass laws that as they see fit, even in a purely crowd-funded government system, that possibility still exists.
Now, if the principle of crowd-funded government is that it must be funded voluntarily, because voluntarism is superior to coercion, would politicians in this society have rights that no one else had, that they were able to force people to, say, not use drugs, not use certain substances, attend conscription or something like that?
So that's still getting into a political discussion as opposed to a program discussion. Each program that you're describing would have a budget. For example, in order to have a conscription program, in order to have that much of military, it would still need the budget to operate that. It takes time and money. It takes people. It takes material to operate programs like that. So there would still be the ability for politicians to propose these programs. But if there isn't a budget to fund them, just like the small town speed trap, if there's not enough money to do it, it's only going to have limited effectiveness. There is no blank checkbook in a crowd-funded government system. There is only a possibility of a program, and then ultimately the people funding it or not funding it, and then the government operating based on the percentage that it receives.
Do you think it's possible that there could be many scenarios in which one person reaps a benefit from something that's that's crowdfunded, but they're not actually chipping in?
Yes, and there's plenty of good examples of that. For example, let's say somebody were to choose to not fund the fire department, but their house still caught on fire. I'm not a believer that there should be a stamp system for the crowd-funded government system. Like if you don't have a fire stamp, your house doesn't get taken care of. I'm a believer that you have to allow the tragedy of the commons. You have to allow the free rider problem, because ultimately, in the military too, there are so many people who are anti-military who would voluntarily not want to give to military action, but still benefit from having a very strong military presence. And that is a reality of the crowd-funded government system, which is even if you don't like it and it benefits you, it will still happen because other people have chosen to pay your share. But consider the converse. Consider the opposite, which is some other people wouldn't want to give to programs that you give to that ultimately benefit them. Some examples might be like a road system or a bus system that somebody else would give to that they don't even use, but they understand its importance to society. So there is that complex situation when you start discussing voluntarily funding versus involuntary funding. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when everybody gives to what they believe in, the society gets exactly what it wants.
Do you believe I'm morally justified in crowdfunding a bank robbery?
So that you get into the discussion of morals, which is very interesting. And in fact, that's another quibble that a lot of libertarians have on Twitter with me, which is that you can start having programs operating that are lacking principle or lacking morals. And that's the discussion that comes down to why we still need to elect politicians. For the people that make the laws, we still have to have a choice between good politicians or bad politicians, whether you agree with a politician or you don't, and the types of laws that they would enact. So ultimately, under your example, which is obviously farcical, however, brings up a good point, which is what if there's an absolutely morally reprehensible program that the politicians support and the people do give money to? What in that situation? And I have to say, and it makes everybody angry on Twitter, if that's what the people want, and that's what the people want to pay for, then that's what the people should get. There should be no moral arbiter stronger than the free market. That is the best determinant for what government should do.
Yeah, and the reason I use robbing a bank is because that's rather trivial compared to invading a country, killing civilians, starving them with a blockade, or the war on drugs. So that wasn't me trying to be, haha, I've got you on a trivial example. That was actually a genuine concern. Do you see this as an end in and of itself, or as an intermediate step to a longer goal? The reason I ask this, and the intention is important here, is because a lot of the initial objection to this is the rich just don't want to pay taxes. So this is sort of like a Koch funded, the rich people, the billionaires don't want any taxes. So they would support this idea. Do you see this as an end in and of itself, or something you'd like to go somewhere else in the long run?
I see the most ideal circumstance for crowdfunded government to be a purely voluntary system. Let's all move to Ancapistan, and you only get what you put into government, and ultimately there's no coercion. But that's a very distant goal. More realistically, in the near term or the short term, the only goals for crowdfunded government are to increase the voluntary relationship between the state and your wallet. And an example of that might be 5%, 10% of your property taxes you're allowed to allocate between a few categories. Crowdfunded government is meant to start off very slow. It is ultimately a very radical idea, but in the short run, it's just meant to introduce the opportunity for citizens to interact more voluntarily with their state and less involuntarily with their wallet. But ultimately, yes, as a crowdfunded government system would progress, you could start to see competition for government services. My favorite example currently is the snowplow program. You could imagine neighborhoods opting out of a snowplow program being provided by their city government because their neighborhood has come up with a much more cost-effective way of delivering the same services. So they all choose, I don't want to give to the city program. We have a great one. Everybody gives a smaller amount, and we get a better result. So there is actually a long-term discussion to be had with crowdfunded government, where you start to consider, why does the government do what it does? And what are some other ways for these quote-unquote essential centralized government services to be provided by the free market, whether for profit or nonprofit? So yeah, you are right. There is a long-term goal. And you did bring up something interesting, which is the idea that this would appeal very much to those with incredible amounts of money who are currently being taxed an incredible amount. And I do believe that to be the case, by the way. I think this presents a great opportunity for people who are currently involuntarily giving massive amounts of money to government to finally choose where in government it goes to. Better yet, which charities or nonprofits it go to. There are so many more better effective ways for us to spend our money than to give 100% of the current tax dollars to 100% of the programs. And it seems immoral to me that we don't get to make that choice. Whether you're giving $1,000 at the end of the year or $1 billion at the end of the year, there is still that same desire. And the desire is to have greater control over where your money goes. And I'm a believer in philanthropy. I'm a believer in a giving, caring society that we live in. I'm not afraid to give people the chance to take huge amounts of money that used to be earmarked for these crazy programs that they or very few people support, and to choose better uses for their money. I trust the voluntary free market to make the best decisions for society.
Yeah, the most common answer I get when I ask libertarians who inspired them is Ron Paul. Now, Ron Paul did have to make some sacrifices in the voluntarist philosophy in order to get on that Republican debate stage. I mean, I can't imagine if he had just been an ANCAP, he would just get on the Republican debate stage and Rudy Giuliani would address him, and Jon Stewart would have a whole segment of him on his show. So I definitely see the sacrifices that need to be made. I see this as a great niche as well, to get people talking about it. Is there any great misconception in the last couple minutes we have here about crowdfunding that you want to address?
The idea that crowdfunding a government would only give the power to those with incredible amounts of money. Because the one lesson that we've seen from crowdfunded government is crowdfunding in general will always give the people with the least amount of money the most power. Look at your Kickstarters and your GoFundMes, where people are giving an average of $1, $2, $3, $5 and doing incredible things because they have strength in numbers. And that same concept applies to government as well. The biggest misconception that I hear is that it gives the power to these people with incredible amounts of money. Well, there are so many people with smaller, medium amounts of money that if they all chose to support causes that they felt to be wise and just, they would be able to have an impact just as big as some of the deepest pockets. So I'm a believer that you can reverse that argument on its head and say that what if it actually gives too much power to the people? What if it actually allows the market of ideas to fully express themselves in our democracy as opposed to what expresses themselves now, lobbyists? What if it actually gives too much power to the people? That's the problem that I see, and that's a great problem to have.
See, the reason I definitely see this as an improvement in the power to the people sort of thing, which is usually just a pathetic politician mantra, is that a lot of people have power with their vote and their influence that they otherwise wouldn't have in the absence of a state because they don't bear the cost for being wrong. People vote for Obama and they get drone strikes and millions lose their health care when he promised they wouldn't. The average person really doesn't bear the cost of any of that. And I still see these motherfucking bumper stickers, Obama 44. They still haven't taken them off because they're so proud. So, yeah, I definitely see this as an improvement on both fronts. Theodore, thank you so much for your time. What's your Twitter handle and what is your website?
My Twitter handle, you can find me in the mean streets of Twitter at crowdfundedgov. And I'm more than happy to have any discussions out there. Please let me know, why is crowdfunded government a bad idea? I don't want your support. I want your criticisms. Tweet me your hate. It helps me strengthen the idea. I love the debate. And for longer form essays, when I get the chance, I like to put up a blog at www.crowdfundedgovernment.com. And that's where I keep a podcast archive of different interviews that I've done and some longer form pieces that don't fit into the little box in Twitter. But definitely my encouragement is reach out on Twitter, disagree with me, spread the idea to people who hate it most of all. Bring them my way. Because every time I get a criticism, I've tweaked the idea for crowdfunded government just a little bit more, and it's becoming a little bit more of a perfect idea every time I get that. And Keith, thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to talk about why we should be voluntarily crowdfunding all government programs.
Thank you for spreading the message of voluntarism. One great way I've sort of communicated this message, I don't say crowdfunded government because I don't advocate government at all as a libertarian and anarchist. So I say, just in the title you can see, crowdfunded public goods. So things that we now consider as public goods, roads, schools, fire departments, things that it's hard to, they're not really commodities, but they're more used by people, and the benefits and costs are more dispersed. One great way of doing this is asking them, what is so virtuous about the state that they get to force us to fund things and no one else gets to? Is it because the politicians are so much more honest, so much more virtuous? They predicted what's coming in the future so many other times. There's such a lack of corruption. To the contrary, the most evil, vicious psychopaths are attracted to this position because they know people can't opt out of funding them. That's how evil they are, and that's why I love ideas like this. Theodore, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.